Dit is Dinsdag die 26ste Maart. Hier is ander mense ook in die huis. 'n Hele klompie ander mense en ek kan op die oomblik nou niks doen aan die agtergrondklanke nie, maar ek glo dit sal nie 'n probleem wees nie. Will loved people and life, liked to be part of it and to be popular. The idea of killing appalled him, yet without thinking and a blind trust, he had disregarded and violated his few principles by partaking in this monstrous deed. Despite his remorse and grief, he had never bothered to learn the final outcome. In his mind, there was only one: death. Now his eyes slowly focused on the slender figure in the doorway, and for a moment he thought that Tony had brought him a girl. Then he recognized her. "Miss Selina," he mumbled and tried to stand up, lost his footing and fell back onto his bunk. "Miss, come in, miss." He reached for the light switch. Selina blinked uncertainly in the sudden bright light and glanced around the small cabin, except that it was a bit untidy at the moment. It bore all the traces and signs of typical male accommodation. A case of wine was standing in the corner, an empty bottle on the floor, midst a wild array of men's magazines and discarded clothes. "Why, Will," he exclaimed, "you look awful. What's wrong with you?" Alarmed, she quickly sat down beside the man, whose usually cheerful features were now dulled with drunk and misery. "Oh, miss," he croaked, hanging his head in his hands. "We did a terrible thing yesterday. I mean, ugly, just awful." She sat stock still, experiencing a sudden dreadful fear, and with a flare of anguish, she remembered all the talking in Ashley's suite, the warning cough whenever she approached. "What was it, Will? What did you do? Tell me about it." She coaxed him gently with a real feeling of compassion. He stared at her dully. "You mean you don't know about it?" "About what, Will?" "The blood and rotten meat to bait the sharks and—" He stopped when he saw her shocked expression and the sudden paleness on her cheeks. He nodded. "Yes," he whispered. "We dumped meat and blood all over the place while the man and girl were down there." "I can't believe it," she breathed, shocked. Will was relieved that she didn't know about it and had no part in it, and was apparently as unhappy about it as he was. She stared at him with a perplexed expression. "Ashley?" she asked, and he nodded quietly. No one spoke for several minutes. "It must have been an awful death," he mused. "They aren't dead, certainly not," she told him, shaking her head. "They are alive and well. Klaus and Murray saw them at the inquest this morning." Will was even more nonplussed. "Inquest?" She nodded. "Preliminary inquest. There was an accident. Their boat ran ashore during the night and was smashed to pieces on the rocks. So nothing had happened to them. You don't have to feel guilty." And she saw the immense look of relief that came over him. Despite her own morbid feelings, she smiled as a little of his own self slowly reappeared in his sun-browned face. "Hell, that's great news." His shoulders squared and a new brightness sprang to his eyes. With a sudden boyish grin, he sighed deeply, relieved. "Heck, Miss Selina, I want no part in murder, no." He shook his head emphatically. "I want no part of that. Yet, you work for Ashley and you did what he said." "That's right, I work for him, but he doesn't own me." "That is good. No one should be owned. I am glad that you feel so strongly about it." And she meant what she said. "Well," she smiled, "I actually came here to tell you that the diving is finally on, hopefully without further problems." We also have permission for the diving, and in a few brief sentences, she replayed what Mary had told them. So Ashley asked me to come and warn you to get the boat and crew ready, and to go and get the gold. Will started to grin. That's the best news I have heard in a while. What is happening to them? The other divers? Shh. Selina placed a finger over her lips, her eyes serious. Think of the gold, just think of the money. They have tried and failed. Now it is your turn and we won't fail, but we have to be careful. They might still try to dive us off. We sail at dawn, she said in a strained voice as she hastily stood up. We? She smiled at him. Ashley had to go back to Cape Town for 2 or 3 days, so I will be aboard for some sunbathing and watching while you men work. Will experienced a strange feeling of joy. He knew that the days ahead were going to be great, and his throat dried at the mere thought of her on the boat. Until tomorrow then, she said, and she nodded, unable to speak. Selina took the elevator up to their suite with a heavy heart. She had known all along that there was going to be a rough play involved. She had agreed to the raid on the Boa's flat and to the takeover of the dive site, but she had never imagined that an attempt on their lives would be made. She realized she did not know Ashley too well, nor could she imagine that what lows he was capable to resort. She didn't know about the shark attack, and she must admit it came as a bit of a shock. It made her wonder about the boat as well. But Will did not know about that. Could she trust him? And she knew she could, remembering his regret. He would not lie to her. No, she decided. The wrecker had not been involved. Was it really an accident? She found Ashley all alone in front of the television and quietly came up to him, slid her arms around his neck and under his shirt, silently watching the screen over his head. Why, Ashley? She asked a couple of minutes later and felt him stiffen under her hands. Why what, darling? The blood and rotten meat for the sharks. Why did you try to kill them? He gave a shallow laugh. Kill them? My dear girl, we only scared the hell out of them, that's all. They won't put a foot in that sea again. But they could have died, right? She pointed out. Ashley grunted and pulled her around the chair and on his lap, his face in sharp contrast with her somber and worried one. Selina, he smiled smoothly. You know me, and I won't lie to you. There wasn't that much of a risk. They probably just swam into the anti-shark cage and up they went, very much afraid, but safe and sound. She looked pleased. Really? There wasn't much danger? You didn't mean to kill or harm them? No, absolutely not. There is no reason for such drastic steps. But you must agree, we had to scare them away from the gold, right? Right. She laughed with relief, feeling a little better. And now their boat is gone. What happened? You didn't have anything to do with that, she asked anxiously. He chuckled. No, darling, they took care of it themselves. So the old man probably had too much to drink and wrecked the boat with their diving gear and all. And now they cannot dive, and it's all yours, all ours. And he kissed her. I am so glad and so relieved, she breathed, satisfied that Ashley was innocent and had intended no bodily harm to anyone. Chapter 9. Rob and Herbie spent 3 hours with Peter Crawford. The big forester and his wife were equally stunned and shocked by the news of old Joss's death, especially in the light of the circumstances. Anne refreshed them all with a strong black coffee and freshly baked scones, before hurrying off to lend a hand with a large number of tourists in the restaurant and shop. After some talking about their problems, Peter bid them a good day in town and the two brothers drove off. An hour later, they stomped into the popular pub in Plettenberg Bay. Their grim faces reflected their moods, and the bold bartender wasted no time in serving them each a large tankard of draft beer, which quickly disappeared. One look sent the bartender scurrying to refill their glasses. They had suffered a heavy loss. Apart from the death of Jos Verwysing and the destruction of his boat, they had also lost most of their equipment. The new oxygen cylinders were all gone, as well as their additional gear and the borrowed pump. And in the process, they had lost their last assets, for they had stalked every cent and their hopes for the future on this search. They had needed that gold badly, and still did, but their opportunity had been ruined. Rob grieved the death of Jos. It was a brutal way to die. If only he had insisted that Jos came ashore that day. He thought about the sharks. That was the first step to either kill or scare the hell out of them. It had failed, and that same night the sturdy old fishing boat drifted on the rocks. No witnesses, no evidence, and a shore littered with darbies. So easy, no boat and no gear, no diving, and the place was left wide open for them to move in. It was certainly a very fortunate accident. But who was behind it? The one who had started it all. Wasn't it him, Rob de Boer, who had started it all with the damn logbook from the Liberty? Well, there was also Cathy's findings of the ship's bell, but that alone couldn't cause all of the trouble. And Captain Martin's words, hollowing, rang through his mind. Since the Liberty went down, all hell reigned. Men died, those responsible for his carnage, those who had killed for it. And Jos Verwysing's words painfully accusing. They won't stop at murder. None of us will be safe. This treasure is still going to cause blood. It certainly did, and it was his fault. He shivered at the thought, as the ill-spoken words of Martens and Verwysing filled him with a weird foreboding. No one knew what would happen next, for they still wanted that gold. They just had to have it. But how to go about it was the problem, and besides the eventual recovery of the gold, there was still the reality of Jos's death. As Hervey had said, there was no way it could have been an accident. Jos was murdered along with the deliberate sabotage of his boat. "Hey, Rob, what are you going to do about Jos?" he asked, as if their thoughts were the same. "I don't know. I honestly don't, but this round belongs to them. Maybe we should stay away for a few days and let them clear away more of the mud before we make our next move. We will have to." Rob grumbled, and he sucked on his cigarette. "We have neither the equipment nor the money to carry on." And Herbie nodded ruefully. "Then how?" Rob shrugged. "I don't know, Herb, but I'm sleeping on it." "But we are going to give up?" "No," he smiled thinly. "Never." Herbie relaxed. There was a warlike glint in his eyes. "Now you are talking. We will show those bastards." And on that aggressive note, they lapsed into silence again. The bartender refilled their tankards and carefully abstracted the necessary from the money pile. They devoured a late pub lunch, but instead of modifying their sorrow and anger, it seemed to intensify their pent-up emotions. By late afternoon, there was trouble, in capital letters, written all over them. Meanwhile, as the normal working hours flew past, the pub filled with noisy customers, who came to wash down a hard day's labour with a refreshing beer or two. Being a popular place, it was soon filled with a rowdy crowd, and as could be expected, the main topic of the conversation was Jos Visagi's death. All the while, as they speculated and argued about the possible causes for the accident, the tension in the already murderous brothers was steadily building up. Jos was the best bloody fisherman I've ever known, one of the older men declared with confidence. I just cannot believe that he ran his boat aground, he told another, and he knew the sea better than anyone else did. The old fool was drunk. The words cut through the charged atmosphere. A stunned silence fell over the pub as everyone turned and stared in astonishment at Klaus Weber. Rob stiffened with his tankard halfway to his lips. That's right, boys. The old man drank too much and ran his boat onto the rocks. Lieutenant Murray smiled casually, confidently, and silently hoped that it would smother further talk about the subject. The men stared at him, unhappy and uncertain. Nobody had noticed the entrance of Murray, Klaus, and the other two now seated near the door. And nobody saw the young man who slowly pushed himself up from his seat at the counter. When he spoke, his voice was shockingly cold. I thought a verdict hasn't been reached yet, and everyone saw the sickly look of shock that came over both Murray and Weber as they spun around to face Rob de Boer. I thought you were going to send divers down to search for Jos and the anchor, to search for proof that what you have just proclaimed. His voice was hoarse, quivering with anger as he slowly walked towards the policeman. You temporarily agreed on the accident theory, but no one said anything about spreading this absurd story of drunkenness, huh, Weber? Murray licked his lips and Klaus visibly blanched. Things were going wrong. They didn't bargain on finding de Boer here. Look here, de Boer, we know. Oh yeah, Rob sneered. You have some clairvoyant perceptions, Lieutenant. Perhaps then you will know what I'm going to do now. And, as the officer shrugged, he overturned the half-filled tankard on the head of the stunned policeman. You are not even worth the ass of a real policeman, he snarled, and an audible murmur went through the room. The bartender uttered a despairing wail and disappeared behind the counter. And as the beer splashed over the head and down the clothes of the extravagantly dressed officer, Rob swung around and backhanded Klaus Weber viciously with the glass against the head. With a furious expletive, Murray leaped to his feet and grabbed the service pistol from its holster under his left arm. But Derby was there, and his open hand came down on the extended wrist, and the pistol went skidding over the floor. The brawl was on. The two brothers had been spoiling for a fight. Their pent-up frustration and the loss of a friend was enough. A furious Rob went after the sprawled Klaus. He grabbed the bulky Klaus by the hair and jerked him half upright as he slammed a vicious punch into the hated face. But before he could hit again, somebody crashed into his back, groping about his arms, and he let go of Klaus, who fell back to the floor, stunned. Rob went along in a diving roll and flattened Dan Johnson on the alcohol-stained floor. Whipping around, he delivered a stunning blow to the latter's chin that snapped his head backward, and in the same movement he pushed his knee into Johnson's stomach that left the man gasping and groaning in agony. The crowd watched the fight in silence. On the one side was a lawman and his three friends, and on the other side two strangers who had been drinking since early afternoon. and yet it seemed as if the alcohol hardly had any effect on them. Herbie and Murray were engaged in combat, but the easy-going policeman was no match for the well-trained ex-security man, and he collapsed in a heap behind the counter. But there was still Bailey. The ex-librarian found himself standing alone, and he became aware of the encouraging cheers that now came from the crowd. He stood watching, unable to move, until Murray disappeared with a thud over the counter and bottles tumbled from the shelves. He knew he had to do something. Almost mechanically, he lifted the bar stool above his head and crashed it down over Herbie's back and head, sending the lanky figure to the floor. He swung the shattered remains for another blow and took a flying kick in the chest. It was the end of Bailey's fighting spirit as he crashed through the window to the stoep. Rob jerked Herbie to his feet, grabbed a glass jug from the nearby table and emptied the water over his lolling head. Seeing movement, he hurled the empty jug at the rising Johnson, but missed. Herbie shook his head drunkenly and staggered up against the counter. Rob felt relief. No serious damage had been done. He never saw Klaus Weber until the latter seized him in a bear hug from behind, lifting his body in his powerful arms and squeezed. Rob gasped. The man was immensely strong, and he felt the air being expelled from his lungs. Klaus had never been beaten in a fight, and his fighting prowess was something he was excessively proud of. This was his home ground, his people, and he just couldn't imagine being beaten. The fact that he was brought down so quickly and easily during the opening moments of the fight was just too much, and he saw red. Roaring like a wounded buffalo, he slowly increased the force around the smaller man's chest, and through his fury he could hear the nervous and straining rasping of de Boer's breath. He was faintly aware of the crowd's enthusiastic cheers. The muscles bulged and his massive arms and chest as he knew that he had the fight in his pocket. But Rob de Boer wasn't put away that easily. There was a sudden, vicious explosion in his left foot as Rob forcefully stomped his feet down. At the same time, hooked his right leg around those of the bigger man and heaved. Klaus screamed with pain as they toppled over backwards. Something exploded in his ribs. Rob once used his elbow, and the deadly arms about him burst open as they hit the floor. Dazed, gasping for breath, he scampered away and to his feet. He stood watching Klaus warily. He had to stay away from the man's arms. He thought and lashed out with a straight right into the bloodied face, but the big man had hardly noticed. With a roar, Klaus stormed. The cheering and jeering slowly died away, and a silence fell over the pub as the crowd watched in fascinated horror. Standing chest to chest, the combatants fought with an animal savagery, slugging and punching each other relentlessly. Blood streamed over tattered, torn clothes, and breaths rasped in the stunned silence. The other fighting caused with Johnson joining Murray, and when Herbie wanted to go to Rob's aid, he was duly stopped from interfering. And, blood bespattered, he watched the fight where all reason was being abandoned. Rob saw the first coming through the red haze of blood. He tried to evade it, but was too slow, and bold fist exploded against his head. He was vaguely aware of falling backwards, of something breaking under him. Then he was on the floor, and in his dazed confusion, he saw Klaus towering above him. His head was dull, dazed, and he tried to think, knowing that he had to. He kicked out, his heel connecting with the braced knee. It wasn't a forceful kick, but unsuspected, and Klaus went down. Rob staggered to his feet just as Klaus swung again, but fortunately the blow missed. He tasted the salty blood in his broken mouth and spat out reddish spittle. Through sullen eyes he saw Klaus cringing in again, saw the victorious sneer on his face, and he remembered it with sudden clarity. The day at Cathy's rondavels, and he heard his words, "We shall meet again," and remembered Cathy's tear-streaking face. And all his fury, anger, and hate were concentrated on the face in front of him. It became a shark's, a vicious great white that wanted to devour Cathy. His head and vision cleared and focused on the bloody, despicable face in front of him. Klaus pushed out a fist, and Rob hit him. A terrific straight left that caught the bigger man on his chin, shook him to his feet, and Klaus wavered. Rob delivered the coup de grace. He swung his fist in a right uppercut, and it carried every ounce of strength and weight and fury behind him. The magnificent punch exploded in the bloody face, distorted it, and lifted the 230-pound of flesh and bone off the floor, leveling it before it dropped to the floor. It was all over. Klaus Weber never knew what had hit him. Rob stood with wobbly legs, still possessed by the killing rage, glowering through swollen eyes at the silent circle of faces that stared back at him. "Who else says Jos Verwysing was drunk?" He rasped through the broken lips, his chest heaving breathlessly. They stared at him. Disheveled and bloodied, exhausted and numbed with pain, he stood there, and the men were gripped by a feeling of mixed admiration and shame. For here was a stranger, a visitor, For here was stranger, a visitor, who stood up in defense of an old man's honor. At that moment there was a commotion at the door, and the crowd fell back as Sergeant Verwysing and 5 blue-uniformed policemen trooped through, pushing their way to where Rob was standing. They stopped and stared in surprise. Their eyes slowly shifted from Rob to the prostrate figure of Klaus Weber. The sergeant glanced incredulously around the pub, saw the broken furniture, the shattered glasses and bottles, and lastly turned with accusing eyes to the silent and uncomfortable spectators. "You could have stopped it," he accused the guilty, shifting men. "Arrest them, Sergeant!" A shrill voice came from behind the counter amidst the hushed silence that hung over the pub. Surprise registered on the sergeant's face. He obviously had not expected the lieutenant to be part of it. Lieutenant Murray, cautiously dabbing a sodden handkerchief on his bloody lip, seemed oblivious of Sergeant Verwysing's surprise. "They started it. I want them locked up." "They need medical attention, sir." "To hell with that. I say, lock them up." The sergeant nodded, his face once more expressionless as he noticed one of the men handing the lieutenant his gun. "As you say, sir. Deprieux, get an ambulance for the others," he told one of the constables, and gestured toward Johnson and Bailey, who were hunching over a moaning Klaus. He faced the crowd. "What the hell are you staring at?" Verwysing briskly demanded from one in particular, and all of a sudden everyone seemed to find his tongue at the same time. Spontaneous and excited talk burst out in the ruined pub. The bartender, seeing a good opportunity to boost his sales, didn't close, and amidst the wild laughter and noisy chatter, Sergeant Visagi led a battered Rob and Herbie through a backslapping crowd of people to the waiting police van. Rob, on the verge of a total collapse, hung almost unconsciously on Herbie's shoulder as they entered the near-deserted police station. With a constable on one side, they succeeded in reaching the cell without any problem. Once inside, with a barred door closed and locked, Rob stared dully at Herbie. The latter nodded, and together they stumbled to the one and only bed. They unceremoniously dumped on the single occupant on the cold cement floor and flung themselves down. They slept as they touched the mattress, exhausted and battered, but victorious. The old drunk stirred uncomfortably on the cold floor. Sergeant Visagi quietly stood watching through the bars. There was a faint smile on his face. These are men, he thought, the kind of men he liked, rugged and staunch. He had heard of Bieber and Marie's unfounded and outrageous accusations about his uncle, as well as the details of the fight. He was worried about the station commander. What the hell was the lieutenant playing at? Dan sê, dit is dan dit vir vanaand. Geniet die res van jou aand en luister môre aand weer na The Long Lost Grave. Dankie dat jy like, subscribe, share en die bel button druk en ook vir jou ander ondersteuning. Tot môre.